Once upon a time, there were two little girls named Deb. One little girl grew up to be a preacher while the other grew up to be a pagan, and they both grew up to be the very best of friends. Join the preacher and the pagan as they take a fresh look at Christianity, from the inside out and the outside in.
Welcome to The Preacher and the Pagan. I'm Debb Suddard. I'm Canadian and I am a preacher.
Hi, I'm Deb Baudoin. I am from the United States and I am a pagan in this group. How you doing, my fine friend to the north?
I'm doing just great. How's it down there?
It's stinking hot. We're in the desert. How was this exciting? Was this our first episode of the podcast? You excited?
I am. We've been talking about this for a long time and we're finally doing it.
So yeah. So what for our listeners, what is this podcast about? What is going on with the preacher and the pagan?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting title, and I'm so glad that you came up with it. You know what? I really feel the call to talk about so much of what Christianity is, because the media presents something that Christianity isn't, and a lot of right-wing stuff is looks really scary, but it's not who Jesus was. It's not who the church was. It's not. We've had our dark moments for sure, and I'm not going to excuse our history, but there's so much more, and I'd really like to tap into that.
Like that. Yeah, I was raised Roman Catholic, but I went through about a 10-year agnostic period before coming onto my own pagan faith. And one of the things that drove me away from Christianity was there was such a discrepancy between the method and the message. You know what I mean? It was like the message was really awesome, but everything I saw around me just did not support that message at all. And a lot of the reason I want to do this is because of our 20-year friendship. Talking to you about this, you've really justified my feelings that no, there's a better way for Christians to be. There is an actual truth there. You know, I don't have to be a Christian to know that something's going wrong. And if I can be part of the help to get it back to where it's supposed to be, it's just a force for good in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's it's really fun if you look at Christian history, and that's part of my background, is that every 500 years, there's like a corrective that goes on. So the first 500 years, it was the fall of Eastern Roman Empire and the changes that happen in society. Then you go another 500 years, and it's the split between the East and West. And then another 500 years, it's the Martin Luther and the Reformation. We're in that 500-year period right now. And I'm really one of the few people I know who's kind of excited to see changes in the traditional way the church is done, because it's not meeting people's needs. And, you know, Christianity survives outside of the church institution. And that's something that I think people have to start to grapple with, that the physical church that you might have experienced is not necessarily the church of believers. And that gets to be a little bit disconcerting for folks who have never spent a whole lot of time looking for a new community because they think that their church experience is the only way that they can experience Christianity. And that turns a lot of people off.
Yeah. Well, and you know, it's funny because your website and your online ministry is called The Barefoot Evangelist. I'm from the United States, where evangelical is a hot button word. How do you deal with this? What is Barefoot Evangelist, and how do you deal with people who hear that word and just shut down?
Well, in Canada, it's a little bit different. I mean, we've got some sensitivity around the word. It's not as much of a hot button as it is in the States. But quite honestly, I picked evangelist to poke the bear. Evangelist, the word itself simply means the teller of the good news. That's it, full period. There is no additional value on that except the person who tells about the ministry of Jesus Christ. And quite frankly, I'd like to get the word back. I'm really kind of tired of right-wing folks taking the language and owning it, and left-wing folks giving it up. And, I've watched that happen for the past 40 years, and I'm kind of done. I want our language back. And evangelist is the first word that I'm starting with, because all it means is someone like me, someone who talks about this stuff, someone who makes it real and meaningful and brings up questions for folks. They want to find out more about it. I feel really called to do that kind of thing. So that's evangelist. The barefoot part, that's just personal. I hate shoes. I'm one of the few women you'll ever meet who hates chocolate and hates shoes. So I preach barefoot. And one day I was in one of the churches I work in, and someone said, "Oh, Deb," and they're like, "Oh, the barefoot preacher." So I took that. And then I looked online, and there's like 7 or 8 barefoot preachers, and they're almost all Canadian women.
I think this may have something to do with the shoe industry in Canada.
Well, yes, but you'd think with all the snow we get up here, we'd be a little more interested in it. But to me, it was just, the barefoot was just me. I'm more comfortable that way. And evangelist is me kind of saying, nope, it's our word, we're taking it back. So yeah, a little bit of rebellion there.
I have to share a story, and I told you this a while back, and I don't think you I don't think you remembered it at the time, but when we met years ago, and it's something totally non-religion related, and I remember you had just decided you were going to go to school to become a preacher, and my very first reaction was, "Oh man, really?" Oh, she's so cool. Why would she be a crazy evangelist? I don't want her to be a crazy Christian person. Of course, I was living knee deep in the place where they think there were dinosaurs on Noah's Ark. So at the time, I had a very different perspective on evangelicals and Christians. Is that why you decided to become a preacher, because of that whole reclaiming?
Oh, no, not at all. I do remember that story, though. You did tell me. I always laugh at that, because I joke on paper. I look really conservative, because I also homeschooled my 4 kids. So
yeah, that was another red flag.
Right? Okay. Well, first of all, Canadian culture and American culture are 2 very, very different things. And secondly, I laugh about what I look like on paper, because I'm pretty left wing. I'm pretty leftist when it comes to my life in general. I don't follow the straight and narrow path on too many things. Why I became a preacher? Okay, honest story. I actually got my first master's degree before we met, before I had kids, before I was married. And I was sitting in the back of class, and ironically, it was the history class, which is, the irony there is because that became my focus. But at the time, it was like 7:00 on a Monday night, and I am such a morning person. It was just a bad thing for me.
That's another red flag, honey.
So that's a personal one. But I was bored out of my tree and sitting in class, and the professor was droning on, and I had a moment of calling, and that's what we use, the language we use in Christian tradition. And I felt this voice behind me say, "Translate," and the meaning of what was said to me was not, take Greek and put it into English, but take the stuff that you're learning and make it accessible to other people. And that's why I'm a preacher, is because I've been given this sense that I'm supposed to do something with my education. I've got 2 master's degrees now in the subject matter, and I'm looking at further education, but there's so many places that it's just done so badly. And I remember being at a women's dinner, about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe. And I was talking about some kind of work, the academic work I was doing. And this woman, older woman, been in church as long as she'd been alive, I'm sure, started physically shaking. And I didn't know what was going on. And finally she looked at me, and she was angry, like beet red, just venomous, almost spitting. And she said, "I've gone to church my whole life. How did I not learn about this?"
Yeah.
I have moments like that keep reinforcing, why am I a preacher? Because I keep one foot in the academy and one foot in the community, and they need to know what's going on with each other.
You know, I'll be honest with you. I attended 10 years of Catholic school, and the 3 years that I didn't go to Catholic school, I did catechism, every Saturday morning. I was in the church hall doing my catechism. I was a good little Catholic doobie. And I felt the same way. I remember once in 11th grade, a history teacher taught our religion class, and it was the only, in 10 years of religion class, 3 years of catechism, the only class that I ever really got an understanding of what it was all about. And I was like, why doesn't everyone teach religion like this? How can you understand it if you don't understand the historical context?
Absolutely.
And honestly, I feel, I don't know if I'd still be a Christian if I'd known someone like you back then, but I know I wouldn't have had 10 years of rage-filled agnosticism that I had to work through before I found my own path.
Yeah, and you're not alone, and it's so unfair. And one of the things I look at my peers, and I'm just do not understand the responsibility we have to make this accessible, and it's frustrating. So that's one of the reasons we're doing this podcast, why I do my website, why I've got a YouTube channel, why I have information out there. I'm now at the point where I've got people literally around the world who are tuning in on the regular basis. I mean, I've never communicated with them. I don't know what they're getting out of it, but they're getting something because they keep coming back. And context is so important. I try to explain context. It's like you're looking at a picture, and instead of seeing the main thing the picture's about, you're looking at all the background, the colors, the layers, the textures, if there's any activity going on. That to me is contextual. And when I bring that into my preaching, I'm looking at providing the background, what's going on culturally, what's going on socially, what does it possibly mean? For instance, one that's misunderstood is if they slap you on the right cheek, offer your left cheek. And that was actually an act of rebellion. And a lot of people take it as an act of submission and permission for abusive authorities to just continue abusing. But the actual reality, the contextual reality of it was that in the culture that Jesus was living in, it was acceptable for someone who had authority over you to use corporal responses, corporal punishment. And there was a ritual about it. You gave him your right cheek, and it was always a man that was doing the hitting, never a woman. You gave them the right cheek, and once they slapped, it was done. But Jesus just stood there and offered the left cheek, which is basically a daring of the person to break social convention. I mean, how many women would have managed better if they had known that, instead of having someone tell them that you're supposed to just take it when someone hits you?
I was 2 years old when I learned that. I mean, like right now, this is the first I'm hearing of that. That's cool.
That is context. So Jesus was a rebel. Jesus pushed the buttons. He didn't get killed because he was a nice guy. He got killed because he was a threat to the authorities. And that's the guy that we're following here, not some passive crybaby who didn't have any other emotions. This guy was shaking things up.
Yeah. So what's the difference between, say, a contextual theologian and like just a regular historian? I mean, what's the difference in that?
Well, sometimes I think I put my own language around it as well, but it's looking at some of the other academic fields. It's bringing anthropology in, it's bringing archaeology in, it's bringing art history in, it's bringing in a whole lot of things. You can look at a historical document and learn a whole lot about the culture, but until you actually study a little bit more about the mores, the way people interacted at that time, the document's kind of flat. So when you start to understand, okay, this is why they dressed like that, and this is why they spoke like that, and this is why the food they chose was in that context, and this is why they possibly made these rules to stand out in a sea of, I can't think of the word, of basically being the politically controlled people that they were. I mean, you have to realize the Bible, from Genesis straight through to Revelation, was written by people who were under occupation. There's not a time when the Bible was written where these people had political control over their lives. Everything they did was in the shadow of the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Egyptians or the Greeks or the Romans. So they had to identify, they had to develop their own cultural context within that. And so much of that context influences how the Bible was written and how we now need to read it. Mm-hmm. And one of the big problems is that people read back in time. So we take our 21st century experience and ideas and we project back and think that's how it always was. And the case is that's not.
And do you think this is where most people go wrong when their understanding of Christianity and of their faith?
Absolutely. One of the things that I think is most disheartening is when people treat it like it's easy. Like understanding the Bible is simple. Understanding Christian theology is simple. And quite frankly, we have mass media to point to for that, because they have a very simplistic, when they represent Christianity at all, it's extremely simplistic. It's like bargaining with God, like God is Santa Claus. It's don't say naughty words, like don't ever say any expletives. Dress this way, walk this way. You know what? Jesus wasn't about any of that. Didn't give a damn. Did not give a damn. He was looking at people who were struggling to survive, and he promised them a new way of living if they would just look at each other as being equally valuable to themselves. In a highly stratified society like he was in, that was revolutionary stuff. The message that you mattered, and I look around our society today, and I don't think there's a single message that we need more than a simple truth that you matter. Everything about you matters.
And, I think that's one reason I was drawn to the pagan culture. I honestly am not, I was raised Roman Catholic, so I am completely allergic to organized religion at this point. I am basically an eclectic mess of different theories and faiths and beliefs, and I pretty much come up with my own path. But one thing that is pretty much accepted across the board in pagan communities, especially the witching community, is do as you will and harm none. Mm-hmm. And it's such a simple thing, but when you unpack it, it means, yeah, make your choices, live your life, do you. But your freedom doesn't give you the right to hurt anybody else. And It doesn't give you the right to hurt yourself either, because you're someone worthy of decency. And it took me a long time to get from this paint by numbers, this is what you have to do approach to, okay, I have to be responsible for my own faith. I have to be responsible for my own choices. It took a long time to get there, but as I listened to you talk, it's like I was already there at the beginning. I just had to find my way back to it. Just the only thing that are different in the attitude is the same, but you're doing it from a Jesus point of view. I'm doing it from a goddess point of view. The same thing is happening. We're just calling it by different names.
Absolutely. And I think that's where it's so important for people from different traditions to talk and to talk openly, not talk with the expectation of conversion.
Oh, thank God. Don't try to convert me. That ain't going to happen.
Oh, well, we've had this conversation. No, it's not going to happen. First of all, you'd be useless to me because you'd be agreeing with everything I have to say. That's no good. No, but seriously, when I talk with my Jewish friends and my Hindu friends and my Muslim friends and my pagan friends and my agnostic friends and my atheist friends, when you remove the emotionality of conversion out of the question, there's some rockin' good conversations going on, because at the end of the day, I think we're all kind of searching for the same thing. It's just in different paths. And that's one of my favorite parables is actually a Hindu metaphor that says there's a lot of paths up the mountain, but if you spend all your time walking around trying to convince everybody else that your path is the right one, you're never going to get to the top.
I like that.
Yeah.
My version of that is if God can create 31 flavors of Baskin-Robbins ice cream, absolutely he can create more than one path to salvation.
I love that. Absolutely.
It's my ice cream theory.
Yeah, it works, Pick a metaphor. That's actually, if you look at Holy Writ in any tradition, it's all metaphor.
Yes. And that's another thing that we talk about a lot in our conversations, is about the idea of approaching the Bible and all, literally, in my opinion, all religious texts from a context not of literalism, but of metaphor.
Yeah.
And my degree is in English, so metaphor is kind of my thing. Mm-hmm. It's like you want to just take people and shake them and say, come on, it's a metaphor. It's not that hard. But apparently it is hard sometimes, isn't it?
Well, I think it's hard for modern hearers because we are so caught up in the scientific method. And one of the things when I was teaching high school, Sunday school, I used to draw a timeline on the board. I mean, they tease me about it mercilessly, but it really helped them understand, here's Jesus, here's when he died, here's the Reformation, because we're Protestant. Here is when the Enlightenment happened, and here we are today. There's only 400 years removing us from the Enlightenment, where we started developing scientific methods and the rules of how to go about engaging something. And there's a lot of thinkers smarter than I am that are pointing to that time and saying, in our attempt to understand everything, we've become more literal. And if you look at all ancient texts, they predate this time in history. They are not looking for literal. And in fact, in the Hebrew times, the first century times, how people would have something proven to them is because it would keep being repeated over and over again, and it would become its own intrinsic truth. So when you look at the scriptures and you see the same stories, the same thoughts popping up over and over again, it's not because they're bad editing. I mean, could be that bad. It's that the more they heard something, the more truth, the more weight it carried. And I think we've lost that bit of wonder, and we've also lost the humor. And that's one thing that really drives me crazy. That I've more than once preached on something, and I've looked at the congregation after I've read it and said, "You can laugh now," and they're so nervous that they're going to laugh.
I remember one of the first sermons I heard you preach. You had sent me a recording of it, and you called teenage Jesus a jerk. And I remember it's like this gasp of horror from your conversation, your congregation.
Yeah, but they have to tittle. I mean, if you think about it, Jesus at 13 talked back to his mother. And every mother will tell you a 13-year-old talking back like that, it's not going to end well. and then he proceeds on, and there's this engagement he has with a Gentile woman where he says, "Go away, I'm only here for my people. I'm not here to feed the dogs." And she gets in his face and says, "Yeah, well, even the dogs get to eat crumbs." And he has to stop and say, "Oh, you're right." And then he gives what she's asking for, which I believe is healing for her child. People, for some reason, read the Bible like they're listening to Charlie Brown's teacher. And I don't know what we have done as a preaching class to make people think they cannot laugh at Scripture. Some of it's downright hilarious. There are sea monsters in Scripture. We've got a talking donkey in Scripture. My favorite is Acts of the Apostles, when the Spirit comes on them and they all start talking differently, and someone yells, "Oh, they're drunk." And Peter yells back, "No, it's only 9:00 in the morning." That's funny.
Yeah.
And people need to loosen up a lot about the Bible. It's a book of people trying. Well, it's a library, first of all. It's not one book. It's a library of people trying to figure out their relationship with God. And sometimes that's painful, and sometimes it's idiotic, and sometimes it's angry, and sometimes it's funny, and sometimes it's lazy. But it's all just people trying to figure out who they are in a relationship with God. That's it. No great mystery there, except the ultimate mystery that they never do solve. And we haven't. 2,000 years later, we're still trying to work it out. But that's because it's always personal. And every person has a different take on how it's supposed to go. But it's not meant to be somber and sterile. It's meant to be joyous and life-giving.
You had a question in our list. We have a little list of questions that we're working from, and It's number 5. Why is it important to start these conversations separating belief from information? What does that even mean, separating belief from information?
Yeah, I think belief as the nicer side of indoctrination. I find that a lot of people are just intellectually hungry for this stuff. And they're not necessarily wanting to change their perspectives, but they want some answers to questions they've had for a very, very long time. And that's what I mean about the taking the emotional level of conversion out of the conversation. You also have to take away the expectation that whoever you're talking to is going to change their belief system based solely on what you tell them. I'm not about that. That's why I'm never going to convert you, because first of all, it's impossible. You have to be open to it, which is the case with every single person on earth. You don't force anything, never works. So takes it off the table. But these conversations need to happen on intellectual levels before they get to the emotional level of belief, because there's so much bad information out there. And one of the worst responses I've ever heard is when a preacher tells someone, well, you don't have to understand it, you just have to believe it. And it's like, no. Understanding is part of how that goes on. So it's like I tell people, you don't check your brain at the door of the church. I mean, if you've done that, you've done yourself a disservice, because Jesus never asked you to just be mindless automaton when you go into worship. You're supposed to bring your whole self. That means your intellect, means your questions, means your discomfort, your confusion. That all has to come into it. And quite frankly, someone who's good at this job is okay with someone saying, but what do you mean? And then having a response to them.
I've always felt that if your faith is so fragile that you can't stand rigorous questioning, then you probably ought to look at your faith.
Absolutely.
Know?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you hit such a hot button with me with that whole it's a matter of faith thing. I heard that so much in Catholic school, and it always translated to, I don't know the answer. I am on a time schedule here. I got to get through this lesson plan. Please stop talking. Please stop asking questions I can't answer. And it was very frustrating to me, because I was a very curious kid. I wanted to know these. I was a seeker. Yeah. And I felt ignored and frustrated. And I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who still feel that way, because these questions aren't being answered or even explored in a way that is satisfying to people who are seeking answers.
Yeah. And I think that's where people who do my job have really dropped the ball. And churches in general have not put money into training their educators. That's a huge thing for me. If your least impressive amount of money spent is on Christian ed, you're showing your values right there. People have questions. I mean, I've stopped a service to answer a question of a 14-year-old just before Easter. I was doing that. She had a genuine question. She wanted to understand, and it was contextual and it fit. And before I pronounced the benediction, I answered her question, and she was satisfied. And maybe the congregation learned something, because maybe they'd had the question too and didn't know how to ask it or if they should. And I think that's actually, when I talk about how we're in a transition time, I think that we're getting, I think more and more we're going to have to get to a Q&A kind of worship and communal time, as opposed to just passively sitting there listening to whatever you're told, do the responses, and then get up and leave, because that's ineffective. People have questions, and they've got the right to have answers. I really respect the people who have the bravery in the face of a community that is used to staying quiet, but they've got the bravery to stand up and say, okay, I don't understand this. Please explain it to me.
Mm-hmm. And, we talk about the differences in U.S. experience as the Canadian experience. And I'll be honest with you, I've spent many, many years in the local pagan community. As any Catholic will say, you never stop being Catholic. You just lapse for 40 years. But I know so many people who are part of these communities, atheist, agnostic, pagan, different things, that the minute you start talking about Christianity, their guard is up. They have so many people I know have been so wounded by negative experiences in the Christian church, the right-wing, strict evangelical churches, the Roman Catholic Church, the very strict churches. And that is a real trauma that a lot of people are dealing with. How do you think it should be addressed? I mean, obviously own up to the past of the Christians and the mistakes that everyone makes, because we all make mistakes, but how do we move forward from this place where one group of people feels like they have been victimized and traumatized by another group of people? How do you find connection there?
Well, I'm hoping this podcast will help. A lot of times, in my experience anyway, when I meet a group of people who have been that badly hurt, and it happens in Canada too, one of their first responses to me is, I've never met someone like you, or I didn't know people like you existed. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. I think letting people know that there are Christians who are just as critical of this treatment as the people who have left because they feel victimized by it. I am really rough on the right wing and uber conservatives of my tradition. I will call them heretics. I do not think they are representing a God of love the way we've been asked to. And I think it's a long past time that Christians started to call each other out on that. Another thing added to that, I guess, would be just simply being there to hear it, to hear the hurts, to hear the questions, to hear the confusions, to hear the anger. You know, like this woman I described, like how could I have been going my entire life and never hear anything like this? There's something about Christian thought that really bothers me and boggles my mind. And that is how, when any other approach to anything intellectual, you gather your facts and draw your conclusions. When it gets to faith, it's like people have their conclusions, they try to make the facts fit it. I'm trying to explode that dynamic and get back to, okay, this is what was going on. Now let's draw some conclusions. I can't go back in time and make things better for these folks, but I'm hoping that I can hopefully heal some of the cuts and scars just by openly talking about it and saying, yeah, you got a really crappy experience. That should never have happened to you. Okay.
I don't know if the podcast people, if we've mentioned this, but I am a lesbian and I've been with my wife for 20 years. And I will tell you, and you know this because you're the person who gets the question, she wasn't even raised in a particularly religious environment, but every few weeks or months or so, it'll come up. Am I going to hell because I'm a lesbian? I think you and I need to do an entire episode on hell because, frankly, that concept has been used as a weapon against so many people who don't fit the norm, who are outside of the box. Yeah, well, and to be fair, I joke about me looking really conservative on paper. It's been used against me too. I've got my own story of being really badly treated by the church. And I was asked in an interview a couple of years ago why I didn't lose faith. And I just kind of looked back at them. I said, my faith is in God, not the organized religion. And they weren't quite sure how to take that response. You troublemaker, you. I love it.
Absolutely. Are you kidding me? I follow the guy who tore up the temple, took a whip to people. I have no problem racking hell. Yeah, I think there's just so many little things that are done so badly. And we have to look at Hollywood and the media for perpetuating a lot of it, but they didn't originate it. The concept of hell is just so badly done. Yeah, you're right. That's going to take an entire episode just on the various ways the Hebrew people understood it and how early Christians understood it. Because I can tell you right now, the way it's being represented in 2021 by people who really push it is wrong.
Okay.
And your wife is not going to hell. She is perfectly fine. She's going to be in paradise with everybody else, sucking down mojitos. She will be fine.
Well, I think she'll want more of a strawberry daiquiri, but
You know what? That's good too.
It's
I
cool.
won't be
Mohi
the
does
bartender,
work.
but it'll be taken care of.
Okay. I think we probably ought to start wrapping this up because I think we've gone pretty much over a half an hour here.
I know.
It'll all get caught up in editing. It's cool.
We will. And I'm really hoping folks, as they listen, there more questions are going to pop up because I love questions. I want to be able to answer things that people really care about. So I'm hoping that the listeners will just pop in with comments and have you thought about this? And this is something else I'm struggling with. And I don't understand that. I really hope we get some of that response because there's so much here. I've got 2,000 plus years to unpack in this podcast with you. And we're going to spend a whole lot of time talking about a whole lot of things that make people uncomfortable and have created a whole lot of wounds. So
hopefully we will be building bridges too, because
that is my dream. Yeah.
Well, that about wraps it up for today. I just want to thank all of you for joining us at the Preacher and the Pagan. We hope you will continue this kind of crazy journey with us. I'm Deb Baudoin from the United States, and you are?
I'm Debb Suddard from Canada. Thank you so much, and we'll hear you next time.
Hey gang, Deb Baudoin here. Early in the podcast, you may have noticed that Debb Suddard said the Eastern Roman Empire fell in the 6th century AD, or CE as they say. Well, she got a little directionally challenged. It was actually the Western Roman Empire. She will apologize in the next episode. We promise.
You've been listening to The Preacher and the Pagan with Deborah Suddard and Deborah Baudoin. This podcast is a two-lady podcast production in conjunction with The Barefoot Evangelist. Our producer and sound editor is Catherine Gordon. Our theme music was composed by Deborah Baudoin. You can reach us at thepreacherandthepagan@gmail.com or by visiting our website at barefootevangelist.ca/podcast.